So this is part one of the Dri Dek install on a 1991 Outrage 17. I ordered all the Dri Dek from dridek.com. It's actually cheaper that way. So there's 59 squares in almond. And I'll just give you a quick layout. So this is going to be on the entire floor. And this will be my third install. I did a 1991 Outrage 17. And then I also did a 1987 Montauk. So I am going to get started. Okay, so this is what a square looks like. And this is 1 foot by 1 foot. And as you can see, it has notches on one side and notches on the other. But then there's two sides that are smooth, because they actually have nubs on them. So there's one square and there's another square. So what you would do is you would actually just line this up like this, and then you line this up, and there's two kinds of nubs. There's basically a small nub, and then there's a larger nub with a ring on it, and that's the one that goes in the hole. And so you'd line this up, and you just push down with your thumb, and it helps to do this in moderate temperature. It's 86 here, so these are actually kind of soft. If it was 50 degrees, they'd be kind of stiff. So that's just how it goes together. Here's just another quick comment about when you're putting these squares together. It's important that they're lined up. So when you push the tab into the hole, if you're pushing at an angle, it just won't go in. So you have to make sure that you basically line it up this way. And then once it's set on top, then you can push your finger and it goes right in. And if you're not lined up properly, it just won't go in, and it's kind of frustrating. Just keep that in mind. An additional pointer. There's a certain pattern to the Dri Dek square, and if you look in the upper right corner of one of the things, you'll see the word Dri Dek stamped on it. And there's also one on the opposite corner. So when I lay these out, one of the ways that I know they're all lined up the right way is that I have all the labels running in the same direction. Okay, a couple questions people are going to have about how you do the layout. I basically measured this deck as one big large rectangle, and then I subtracted for the console. Basically I'm going to do the entire floor with the section that goes underneath the console, and then also I'm going to cut around the chocks for the cooler. And I pretty much already know that this takes 5.5 squares. And if you've ever done tiling in your bathroom, it's the same kind of concept. You want to basically find the center line. So I have 5 squares, 5 full squares basically running the side. And I know there's going to be 1.5 squares in this corner right here. There's going to be 1.5 squares over here. But for the main body right here, I'm basically going to have a little bit of, I'm going to take one square, cut it in half, and I'm going to put one part there and one part on the other end. And I'll do those cuts later. So right now all I'm doing is basically putting the main squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to basically lay those all the way out until I get to the console. And then I'll probably come back and do the cuts. This is just a quick note about what kind of supplies you're going to need for installing this Dri Dek. You definitely want something to put down to protect your knees, because it is a little bit rough on your knees when you're leaning over. And then for actually for tools for using to cut this, there's a number you can actually use that will work pretty well. But what I found from experience is you want something that's kind of small. And I found that these electrical wire cutters actually work really well. The reason is because they're really small and you can actually get in between. And also the back part is smooth, so you can get a nice clean cut. Now, on a prior project, I used big wire cutters that look like this. And these work well, but you tend not to get as good a cut. So, and if you don't have one of these, and you don't have one of those other cutters, you don't have one of these, you can always use good kitchen scissors. But what I found is that you can get a nice smooth cut, see, whereas you want to get as close to this surface to get it nice and smooth. And that takes a little bit of a technique that you'll learn. Okay, a little bit of progress. So I trimmed out the back part so I could slide it back. And then I basically trimmed out that little piece, trimmed the back edge of that, and then I basically cut this, using full pieces, cut what I needed to finish this side. And then on the other side, I need to do the same thing over here. Need to cut a piece for here, trim that off, and then trim off pieces 1, 2, 3. And then that'll get me up to where the RPS is. And I think it's going to be easier if I actually install it in the boat and then trim around the legs. Okay, so it's about 2 hours later. And I basically came in and I installed the RPS, which let me verify that the install is going straight and not crooked. And then basically I wanted to extend out the dry deck to make sure it was straight. So what I did is I basically just connected full pieces all the way up to the bow and then over the cleats and then around the other side. Now, of course, the pieces that are covering the cleats are going to get cut out. But this is just to make sure that this side is lined up with this side and that it's not shifted over. So that's why I laid that out. And then I also laid out down the other side as well. So I pretty much have most of the deck covered and I've got it all lined up. So now what I'm going to do is just finish all the trimming. Now on some of these you can take one square and you can cut one side of it for one side right there. I need a little bit, but I also need a little bit on the other side. So one square can do both sides. And then of course I've got one square, I need 2 squares here that I need to cut out. And then the other thing is I also plan to do the bow locker. So I'm going to get back to it. Stay tuned. Well, I finished trimming around the console and around the cleats in the bow. So as you can see, the decking goes up underneath, but not all the way up through the console. I basically just cut around enough to let the excess just float inside, and it also helps lock it in on both sides. Now one side, you're going to have the smooth edge of the dry deck against the console, like that side, but the other side you're going to have the holes. And so what I did on this side is I just actually cut off the sides of some scrap squares to basically just fill in those holes and make it a little bit more finished. It is far from perfect, but it is a little bit better. Now, in the bow, to be honest, this part actually took a little bit more time, a little bit more effort. And I would actually recommend you going and changing the tool that you use to this. These actually are much better because they can actually cut, if you actually want to do an angle across a piece like this, these are much better to doing an angle across the squares. So I've left the cut pieces in place so you can kind of see, okay, this is kind of what it looked like. And I basically trimmed around, and then basically I just cut, I had this on top, and I just kind of laid it out and basically cut each square as I thought it would be, erring to the side of caution. So at first it was too tight, and then I had to trim a little bit more. And then when you pick this piece up, it looks like this. And you can see from the detail, in some places I got really close, and in some places I didn't. So that's what that side looks like. Now I wasn't able to keep that connection right here. That was a little bit disappointing, but I was able to keep it on the other side. I made the wrong cut. So there is a piece actually right here that keeps this piece connected to this piece, and that's actually really good. And so that's what that looks like. And then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to show you what the bow looks like. So on this model, the boat kind of flares up. So right here it's flat, but here it's curved. And so when you get up here, it actually kind of flares up. So what I did is actually just kind of trimmed it, and it looks kind of like that. Now the flare starts about where my finger is. So in this section right here, I'm actually going to cut down these nubs to make a better transition. And then the same thing on this side. I trimmed off this piece. And I'm going to do the same thing on the back side here where it starts to flare up. I'm going to trim back those nubs 3 or 4 rows in, and then it'll lay flat by the time it gets to here. And it's a pretty tight fit. So just throw that aside. And then you can kind of get, oh, I do have a filler piece there to make. And on the other side as well. But you can get a good sense of what the boat looks like. There's another filler piece there, but there's it all the way back and around the console and around the back. Now I still have to do the bow locker. And I also realized that I also have a live well right under here. And that's got a actual tub, removable tub. And when I ordered the Dri Dek, I figured I would actually line it as well. And then under here is storage. So I'm going to throw a couple squares in there and a couple squares on the other end. And that way any deck water will just run underneath it and my stuff will stay dry. So I'm going to take a break and then come back and we'll work on the bow locker and those finishing up those 2 trim pieces. Stay tuned. So I just wrapped up the final session on my Dri Dek install. And basically I did the bow locker and the live well insert, and also just a square or 2 underneath the rear seats. So underneath this cover, this is a live well insert, and you basically can plumb it for a live well, or you could use it for dry storage. And I plan to use it for dry storage, so I just cut a couple squares, 2 squares for that. I stuck 1 square underneath here. Due to the way the fuel hose and the vent are rung, I can't get it underneath, so I just put it in there. And then there's another square back under there, which is storage as well. I cleaned up a little bit here and there, added some pieces, trimmed a little bit up here in the bow. Underneath this part right here, I basically trimmed off a couple of the nubs so it lays a little flat on the edge. And then the big project for today was doing this locker, which actually I found to be harder than I remember. So what we have is a very funny shape. And I did actually have to burn 1 or 2 pieces to actually figure out how to do this. Basically it's 3 full squares, 1, 2, 3, with a half square, half square, half square, and then some scrap here. And then on this wall, there's basically 2 big squares that I basically cut a curve on the bottom and the top for height. So that's basically fully lined, and I'll load up my anchor and my rode, and then I'll take another picture of it so you can see. So that's pretty much it. I was thinking that I was actually going to be a little bit extra on the quantity, but it turns out I was actually pretty close. I ordered 59 squares, and I think actually I made a mistake on 1 or 2 squares, but actually don't have anything extra. And there's basically the pile of debris of the pieces I couldn't use. There was a fair amount of recycling where I basically would cut a piece, but I'd use the other half for somewhere else. And that is the end of the install. Thanks for watching.